Hello and welcome to Writing Today. My name is Matthew Dewey, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the power of story structure, why it is so important, and give you some advice on how to effectively use it. As always, you can read this blog post on my website, thepennedsleuth.com. There's a link to that in the description below. And if you are interested in checking out one of my free courses on writing, I have a link to a free course on fantasy world building also in the description. And if you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. With that said, let's go over some of the basic elements that make up story structure. First, let's talk about what story structure is. There are 5 key elements that make up basic story structure, and you are probably using a few of them already, whether you know it or not. It's just that some of them might go by different names. These 5 elements are exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. So let me explain this sequence of elements one by one, first starting with exposition. Exposition is the introduction to a story. Like most expositions, this is where most explanation is done, but very little action. The reason that most stories start this way is that you want the reader to understand what kind of story they are in for. And this is really important, especially if you want to capture the reader's interest in the first few chapters, which, let's face it, is what we all want to do. The second element is rising action. Straight after the exposition, or introduction as we may know it, we are then introduced to the main conflict. It's here that we establish the main character's ambition or goal for the story. The scene is set, we've met some characters, but now what happens? Well, typically, the main antagonist will wrong the protagonist in some way, and this is how the story really begins. Sometimes the story begins with the protagonist already pursuing the antagonist, whatever that may be, because we are better thrown into the action rather than introduced to it. At least that's what some authors believe. Typically, the rising action element in the story is the largest part of the story. And that makes sense when you consider the third element to be the climax. The climax is when the tension is at its highest. Usually it is the turning point in the story. It can happen at any moment, but usually it's in the final act. It is typically the final battle between good and evil. It is the final challenge before uncovering the treasure trove. Whatever it may be, this is the final scene that the story has been leading up to. The fourth element is falling action. After the climax, the problem has been partly resolved. The bad guy is in handcuffs or sleeping with the fishes. The treasure is in hand, or in the hands of the most deserving. The story is wrapping up, some loose ends are being tied off, and the last questions are being answered. When it comes to basic story structure, the fourth element, the falling action, is much like the after party that comes after the main event. Fifth and finally, the resolution. Your story has come to an end and needs a fitting conclusion. That is the final element. At this point, the main conflict is fully resolved and all the loose ends that needed to be addressed have been tied off. The main characters speak their last thoughts before the words, "the end." Now, some writers won't be using this story structure, but most do. And when it comes to the lengths of each element in the story, that varies from story to story as well. It really does depend on the kind of story that you want to tell. But I'm going to be telling you now why story structure like this matters. It is widely believed that story structure plays a key role in the success of a story. A poorly structured story comes off as an incoherent mess of scenes, which often leads the reader to believe the writer has no clue what they are doing as the story progresses. Story structure helps you convey themes and messages. It helps add impact to your scenes. It helps you to maintain the pacing and the flow of your story. Without a good structure to your story, the feeling you are trying to create can easily be broken. The quality of the writing can easily rise and fall. And these are inconsistencies that you really don't want. And that's why story structure helps you organize events into a logical and engaging sequence of scenes. And it's super effective too. It is the reason that most authors and screenplay writers use the 3-act or 5-element story structure. It is the most effective way to communicate a story to the reader, as it is the structure that almost every reader is familiar with. If pacing and flow are important to you, you can't go wrong with designing your story around this structure. The only problem that comes with this story structure is how common it is. Most writers and readers are very familiar with this structure, which is why a linear story, as you may have heard, uses the same structure. It is the predictable and expected sequence of events that often occur in a story. A reader understands that in the beginning of a story, they'll be introduced to the world and the characters. Then there's going to be an introduction of some conflict. There's going to be various scenes leading to a climax. There's going to be a falling action and a resolution after that. Most readers will go into a novel unconsciously expecting that structure, just being more interested in the characters and the plot itself than its actual structure. That's why so many writers like to play around with the story structure in order to create a story that is a bit more unpredictable and realistic. But whether they like it or not, most writers will slip back into basic story structure. That is because we want to use the beginning of our novel to introduce the elements and entice the reader. So then we need to keep the rising action and exposition at the start of the novel. And we want the climax and resolution to be at the end of the novel because we want to introduce a series of scenes to get them excited about this climax. At the end of the day, whether you want to use this story structure or try something different, you still need a basic understanding of how a story regularly flows. With that said, I'm going to give you some professional advice on writing story structure and using it effectively. The very first piece of advice is to start with an outline, a skeleton to work with. Don't jump straight into chapter summaries just yet. It helps to start with an outline of your story. The best way to do that is to write out your story in a very informal way. For example, the protagonist is introduced. We learn that they do this for a living and they want to achieve this goal. The antagonist swoops into the scene and does a bad thing. The protagonist goes after them for revenge. There is this scene, that scene, and the other scene. Big fights, big reveals, and so on. Your outline will have a lot more information and a lot more scenes, but I'm not going to write an entire novel's outline just for this example. You get the idea. From there, you can use story structure to help better sequence these events and also introduce new events in some areas where it may be required. My next piece of advice is to establish the conflict early on so you don't bore the reader. When you introduce conflict early on, you let the reader know what the story is about and what they should be invested in. If you plan to publish your work one day, this is essential. Most readers, if they are truly forgiving, will glance at the writing style in the first chapter and the elements you introduce to get a good idea of what they are in for. If they have time, they will even read the first or second chapter, but that also depends on their length. If the reader starts your book but you don't introduce the conflict soon enough, you'll soon find them getting bored instead of interested. You can only introduce so many elements before the reader starts wondering why it is so important. So you need to establish the important characters, the conflict, and the characters' goals early on in the novel, as you don't want them to grow bored before the story really starts. Third piece of advice is to take advantage of the rising action element, as it emphasizes the climax. The rising action portion of your story, as I said earlier, typically makes up the bulk of your story. Despite that, the most exciting, intense part of the story is the climax, and you want to use rising action to build towards it gradually. It's during this main part of your story that you're maintaining reader engagement by developing your main character and your plot. If it's a story about hunting treasure, you're going through all the clues and all the sacrifices that the main character has made in order to find the treasure. The same applies if it's a story of a good guy versus a bad guy. The protagonist goes on a long journey, faces many foes, all leading up to this final battle. And it's at that point that the tension will be at its highest. But it's only been emphasized by the sacrifices, the hardships that the main character has endured to reach that point. The fourth piece of advice is to use subplots to add depth to your story, making it feel less straightforward. This is how you deal with classic story structure's biggest problem. You can make your story feel less linear by including subplots. Smaller stories are usually introduced by other characters. The main plot could be the protagonist getting revenge on the antagonist, but a subplot is a side character achieving justice or finding a fortune, or getting answers to questions that have been bothering them for years. It is important to remember that every character has their own motivations. So if you have a side character who's supporting a main character, be it antagonist or protagonist, that is great. The side character is supporting them because they either like the character or they agree with the main character's goal. But as a character with their own personality, they will have their own goals as well. If you properly consider this fact, you can perhaps create some subplots that will add depth to your story. My fifth piece of advice is to pay attention to the pacing, as it can get away from you. Pacing is an important aspect of any story. I've written many stories that are too slow or too fast. I certainly made that mistake with some novels I worked on as well. Pacing is something that's very important in every story, which is why it's sometimes important to take a step back and examine the story structure and see if you're including too many action scenes or too many slow scenes, which jeopardizes the pacing and thus your story. My final piece of advice is to not take story structure so seriously, especially if it jeopardizes your story. Sometimes you want to introduce a long sequence of slow or fast scenes because it makes sense in regards to your story, if not the structure. And yes, while basic story structure will help you avoid those scenes going too far and maintain that reader engagement, it's sometimes necessary for a character to have a long dialogue or for a few chapters of exposition to be introduced. So if you are having a sequence of scenes in your story that are too slow or too fast and you're wondering if they should be adjusted, take a step back and examine your story again. If it is something truly important to your story and should not be adjusted, then perhaps apply story structure to other parts of your story in order to balance it out. And now here's some of my thoughts on story structure. Story structure has helped me with one of my books, especially when I was struggling to figure out how to move into the final act. I wasn't sure where to make that step. I was just writing my story scene after scene, trying to find that point, but it never came. And all it came down to was taking a step back to examine a proper basic story structure. I then understood that I was taking it too far when it came to the middle section of my novel, the rising action. I was building up towards it, but then at some point I'd missed a point to introduce the climax. And so then the rising action began to level out. That's when the story became boring. So after making some cuts, I was able to comfortably introduce the climax, move into the falling action and resolution. As I said at the start of this video, most of us are unconsciously using basic story structure because we are so familiar with it. It's in the books we read, the movies we watch, and the series as well. And sometimes it pays to consciously accept basic story structure, especially if we've encountered a dead end in our story. Of course, I'd like to hear your thoughts and experiences on using basic story structure. What advice would you give beginner authors who want to add structure to their story? If you are interested in getting some professional guidance in writing your story, I have tons of writing courses available on my Writer's Workshop. There's a link to that in the description below. And if you want to see some of my coursework before you sign up to the Writer's Workshop, there's a link to a free course on fantasy world building in the description as well. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you in the next episode of Writing Today. As always, good day, good night, and happy writing.